I wasn't looking for this. I was researching classical sculpture techniques, the standard academic fare, marble carving, chisel marks, and the slow, patient work of Renaissance masters. But then I found a photograph from the Marble Palace in St. Petersburg, a stone veil, not carved to look like fabric, but draped like fabric. It was folded and creased with a thinness that made it translucent when backlit. I stopped because you can't carve marble that thin. You can't chisel stone into sheets so delicate they ripple like silk. The material would fracture, crumble, and disintegrate under the slightest pressure. Yet there it was, not just in St. Petersburg, but in Naples, in Vienna, and in Istanbul, in churches and palaces across continents that supposedly had no contact with one another. The official explanation is masterful artistry, painstaking technique, and generations of craftsmen perfecting their skills. But the official explanation collapses the moment you examine the physics. Let me show you what I mean. The veiled Christ in Naples was created, we're told, in 1753 by Giuseppe San Martino. It is a full-body sculpture of Christ beneath a shroud so thin you can see the contours of his face through the stone. The veil appears wet, clinging to flesh, and translucent in places. Marble, they say, carved from a single block. Except marble doesn't behave that way. It fractures along grain lines, and it chips when worked too thin. The thinnest sections of that veil are perhaps 2 millimeters thick, thinner than most smartphone screens. How do you carve something that delicate without modern tools, without diamond bits, without precision measuring equipment, and without computer-aided design? You ask the experts, and they speak in generalities, exceptional skill, patience, and years of practice, but they never explain the actual process. They never demonstrate it, and they never show you the intermediate steps or the failed attempts. The learning curve that should exist simply isn't there in the records. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The veiled Vestal Virgin in Rome, the veiled Rebecca in Milan, the bust of Modesty in Naples, and the veiled Truth statue in Vienna were all created within the same narrow window of time, 1717 to 1768. All exhibit the same impossible thinness. All are draped, folded, and gathered as if the stone had been soft when shaped. And here's what makes it stranger. Many of these works were attributed to the Corradini family or their immediate circle. Antonio Corradini created several, and his student, Giuseppe San Martino, created others. The technique appeared suddenly, flourished for 50 years, then vanished almost completely. There was no gradual development, no crude early attempts, and no learning period where the veils were thicker or less refined. The earliest examples are as sophisticated as the latest ones, as if the technique arrived fully formed, practiced for a brief window, then disappeared. Ask yourself why. Why would such a revolutionary sculpting method, one that produced work so breathtaking they still draw crowds centuries later, simply stop being used? Why wouldn't every sculptor in Europe learn it? Why wouldn't it spread, evolve, and become standard practice, unless it wasn't a carving technique at all? The deeper I looked, the more I found references to something else entirely, something the official histories mention briefly, then dismiss. Stone-softening alchemical texts from the medieval period describe processes for mollifying stone, making it pliable and temporarily soft. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were recipes, instructions, and formulas involving specific plants, acids, and mineral compounds. The Incas were said to possess such knowledge, as were the Egyptians and the builders of Gothic cathedrals. But when you search for documentation, for chemical analysis, or for serious scholarly investigation of these claims, you find silence. Not a thorough refutation, just silence, as if the question itself is inappropriate to ask. I found a 19th century account from Colonel Percy Fawcett describing how he witnessed indigenous peoples using a plant extract to soften stone, allowing them to mold it by hand before it rehardened. He took samples, promised further investigation, and then disappeared in the Amazon in 1925. The samples were never cataloged. I found references to a vitriol-based process in Jesuit records from the 1600s, described as a method for rendering stone briefly plastic. The records were fragmentary and incomplete, as if pages had been removed. I found patents from the early 1900s describing chemical compounds that could temporarily alter crystalline matrices in calcium-based stone, filed, noted, and then forgotten. The evidence suggests something much larger. Let me take you somewhere specific. The Palacio de Comunicaciones in Madrid, completed in 1919. Look at the stone facades. The decorative elements aren't merely carved, they are molded. You see organic curves that flow like fabric frozen mid-motion, impossible undercuts that would require removing surrounding stone that isn't missing, and continuous patterns that wrap around corners without seams. The official record says these were carved by hand, but examine the repetition. Identical flourishes appear in dozens of locations. It's not just similar, it is identical down to the millimeter, as if cast from the same mold or pressed from stone rendered temporarily soft. The pattern repeats in Chicago, Philadelphia, Budapest, and Prague. Buildings from the same narrow period, 1880 to 1920, exhibit the same sophisticated stone manipulation, the same impossible thinness, and the same organic flowing forms. And then it stops. This is where Tartaria enters the conversation, not as a definitive empire with clear borders and documented rulers, but as a placeholder, a name for whatever civilization or knowledge system existed before the current historical narrative was written. Let me show you what I mean. The Veiled Christ in Naples was created, we're told, in 1753 by Giuseppe San Martino. It is a full-body sculpture of Christ beneath a shroud so thin you can see the contours of his face through the stone. The veil appears wet, clinging to flesh, and translucent in places. Marble, they say, carved from a single block, except marble doesn't behave that way. It fractures along grain lines and it chips when worked too thin. The thinnest sections of that veil are perhaps 2 millimeters thick, thinner than most smartphone screens. How do you carve something so delicate without modern tools, without diamond bits, without precision measuring equipment, and without computer-aided design? You ask the experts, and they speak in generalities, exceptional skill, patience, and years of practice, but they never explain the actual process. They never demonstrate it, and they never show you the intermediate steps or the failed attempts. The learning curve that should exist simply isn't there in the records. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The veiled Vestal Virgin in Rome, the veiled Rebecca in Milan, the bust of Modesty in Naples, and the veiled Truth statue in Vienna were all created within this same narrow window of time, 1717 to 1768. All exhibit the same impossible thinness. All are draped, folded, and gathered as if the stone had been soft when shaped. And here's what makes it stranger. Many of these works were attributed to the Corradini family or their immediate circle. Antonio Corradini created several, and his student Giuseppe San Martino created others. The technique appeared suddenly, flourished for 50 years, then vanished almost completely. There was no gradual development, no crude early attempts, no learning period where the veils were thicker or less refined. The earliest examples are as sophisticated as the latest ones, as if the technique arrived fully formed, was practiced for a brief window, then disappeared. Because something was here, something possessed knowledge we've lost. Maps help clarify this. 18th and 19th century cartography consistently labels vast regions of northern Asia as Tartary or Tartaria. These aren't speculative maps, they are official French, British, German, and Russian documents all agreeing on the nomenclature. Then, after 1850, the name disappears, replaced with Russia, Mongolia, and China, as if nothing had changed except the labels. But when you examine the architectural record, you find something strange. Structures attributed to local builders or Russian engineers exhibit advanced techniques, sophisticated mathematics, and stonework methods that shouldn't exist according to the available technology. The Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, completed in 1111, was built, we're told, by local craftsmen. Yet the colonnade features 96 identical Corinthian columns, each carved from a single piece of granite, each exhibiting identical proportions, identical fluting, and identical capitals. How do you achieve that uniformity? How do you transport 96 monolithic granite columns, each weighing multiple tons, position them perfectly, and carve them identically without industrial machinery? The official answer is patience and skill, but patience doesn't explain precision, and skill doesn't explain coordination at this scale. Look at the coordination problem. The technique of stone veiling appears simultaneously in Italy, Austria, Russia, and France, not sequentially, not spreading gradually from a single origin point, but simultaneously between 1717 and 1768. Master sculptors across Europe suddenly produced works of identical sophistication using what appears to be the same method. How? There are no trade guilds documented sharing the technique, no apprentices traveling between cities to spread the knowledge, and no published treatises explaining the process, just simultaneous mastery, as if everyone received the same instructions at the same time. When you examine stone softening claims from around the world, you find consistency, not in the methods, but in the archaeological signatures. Sacsayhuaman in Peru features massive polygonal stones fitted together with precision measured in fractions of millimeters, no mortar, no gaps. Stones weighing up to 200 tons are shaped with curves and angles that interlock like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. The official explanation is that they used harder stones to pound softer stones into shape. Except when you examine the stones, you find no percussion marks, no evidence of hammering or grinding. The surfaces are smooth as if molded. The tight fits suggest the stones were shaped while pressed together, conforming to one another. Let me take you back to the veils. I started examining them under different lighting conditions. What I found changed everything. The veiled Christ in Naples, when photographed with raking light at specific angles, reveals compression lines beneath the veil, not carved detail, not tooling marks, but compression lines, as if the fabric had been pressed into the stone while both were soft, leaving an impression that hardened into permanence. The folds aren't carved to represent fabric, they are fabric fossilized in calcium. This raises a simple but critical question. What if the veils aren't stone carved to look like cloth, but cloth petrified into stone? Not through slow mineralization that takes millennia, but through controlled chemical alteration, a process that could render stone temporarily soft, allowing fabric to be pressed into it, then reverting to stone once the process completed. That would explain the translucency, the thinness, the perfect draping, and the impossible delicacy. It would also explain why the technique disappeared, because it wasn't a carving technique, it was a chemical process, and chemistry can be lost, formulas can be destroyed, knowledge can be suppressed. The timeline is critical. Stone softening references appear consistently in alchemical and natural philosophy texts through the 1700s. Then, during the early 1800s, the exact period when centralized educational systems were being established, when scientific academies were standardizing knowledge, and when historical narratives were being codified, these references began disappearing. They weren't refuted or disproven, they were simply removed. Academic curricula that once included alchemical studies shifted entirely to modern chemistry. Libraries were reorganized, and universities purged their holdings of pre-scientific texts as superstitious or outdated. By 1850, the idea of stone softening had been relegated to folklore, treated as a primitive misunderstanding rather than a documented practice. But the buildings remained. The sculptures remained. The physical evidence of techniques we're told never existed remained. How is it possible? How do 18th-century sculptors using hand tools exceed the capabilities of 21st-century artisans using power equipment, unless they had something we don't, not better tools, but different knowledge? I started looking for the missing records, the gaps in documentation, and the places where history should speak but remains silent. The Great Fire of 1812 in Moscow destroyed 3/4 of the city. Records burned, libraries were lost, and architectural documentation vanished. What survived were the buildings themselves, structures that required advanced stonework, sophisticated engineering, and mathematical precision beyond what the available tools should allow. The Chicago Fire of 1871 presents a similar story. Widespread destruction and lost records, but certain buildings survived, the ones built with pre-fire techniques that subsequent construction couldn't replicate. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 saw records destroyed and city archives burned. Yet photographs from before the disaster show buildings exhibiting that same sophisticated stonework, those same organic forms, and that same impossible precision. The pattern repeats. Cities burn and records vanish, but the physical evidence remains. And when they're demolished quietly, without documentation, without preserving samples, and without architectural analysis. Almost as if someone wanted to erase the evidence. Look at what they're demolishing. The Singer Building in New York, completed in 1908, was demolished in 1968, at the time the tallest building ever voluntarily demolished. Why? The official reason was that it was outdated, inefficient, and not profitable. But examine photographs of its stonework. Intricate terracotta facades, impossibly delicate ornamentation, and organic, flowing designs that modern architects admit they couldn't reproduce. The original Pennsylvania Station in New York, completed in 1910, was demolished in 1963. It was one of the most beautiful examples of Beaux-Arts architecture in America, featuring massive granite columns, soaring travertine walls, and vaulted ceilings that required engineering techniques we still don't fully understand. It was demolished for progress. The Larkin Administration Building in Buffalo, completed in 1906, was demolished in 1950. Frank Lloyd Wright called it one of his greatest works, featuring structural innovations decades ahead of their time. Gone. Hundreds of buildings from that same narrow period, 1880 to 1920, were demolished throughout the 20th century, not because they were unsound or dangerous, but because they were obsolete. That word keeps appearing, as if buildings exhibiting superior craftsmanship, more sophisticated engineering, and greater durability than modern construction are somehow less advanced. Unless obsolete means something else. Unless it means evidence of something we're supposed to have forgotten. When you assemble all the evidence, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. There was a technology, a process for manipulating stone, rendering it temporarily plastic, and shaping it in ways our current methods cannot replicate. This technology was widespread, global even, practiced across cultures that had no documented contact. And then, within a single generation, it disappeared. It didn't happen gradually through natural technological evolution where old methods are slowly replaced by better ones. It happened abruptly and completely, with no transitional period, no debate, and no published explanation. The last documented stone veils were created around 1768. By 1800, no one was making them. By 1850, the technique was considered lost. By 1900, historians were treating it as impossible, attributing the surviving examples to exceptional carving skill rather than acknowledging what the evidence clearly shows. Why would we lose a technology that produced superior results? Why would knowledge that took generations to develop simply vanish without a trace? Why would the entire global community of stonemasons, sculptors, architects, and builders simultaneously forget how to do something they've been doing for centuries? Unless they didn't forget. Unless they were told to stop. Unless the knowledge was deliberately suppressed. I want you to look at one final image, the Veiled Truth from Vienna, created by Antonio Corradini around 1750. It is a female figure, entirely shrouded, the stone so thin it's translucent in places. You can see the suggestion of features beneath, a face, shoulders, and the curve of a body rendered in stone so delicate it seems impossible. And now ask yourself, what secret was worth erasing this knowledge? What truth did they veil not in stone, but in silence? Because the buildings remain, the sculptures remain, and the physical evidence of techniques we've been told never existed surrounds us, if we're willing to see it. These aren't primitive attempts at artistry. They're remnants of a sophisticated civilization, a global knowledge system, and a technological understanding that exceeded our own. We didn't invent progress, we inherited ruins, and then we forgot how to read them.